Hey everybody, PA here. It's Affirm night. It's the lab night. It's our last night of the lab. And so we've made it this far. And I just, again, want to thank you for plugging in. Okay, for those of you who have plugged in, thank you. And the best and most important part of what we're doing together is that you're doing it as a group and that you're plugging in. It's more important than anything. And I'll say that till I'm blue in the face. Okay, so I don't think I have to because I think you guys get it. So it's for people who show up, that's when the best things in life happen. So, okay, keep that in mind, and I don't want you ever to forget that. All right, so tonight I'm going to do this in two parts. I'm not going to quite put my safety goggles on yet. I'll do that in part two. But here's what I want to tell you. Tonight is something that's kind of complicated, but I don't want you to check out because you get it. And I'm going to give you something that I think tonight you probably will learn a whole lot about because most of us don't even know this. It's called social advocacy in the church. So what this means just basically is the church operates in the society, in our country, in our world, as an advocate for certain things. And all of those things spring from biblical truths or things that Jesus called us to do and be. Okay? So if we are advocates, we are a voice in favor of something. So let's just say this. Let's say that the Bible talks about wanting to support widows and orphans, and you hear it all over in the Bible. Well, the church then is called to be an advocate for widows and orphans. And in our society, we go to people who create policies and laws, and what we do is, as a church even, we say, we want you to hear our position on this, because our God has called us to look out for widows and orphans. And we want to make sure that the policies that you are creating, as far as we have any influence on your thought about that, that those policies be fair, and especially fair for widows and orphans, because the Bible told us that. So we want to put our 2 cents worth in. We want to advocate for people who probably don't have a voice as much. Maybe they are poor or powerless. And we are able as a church to bring all of our voices together and say, you know what? The Bible tells us this. We want you to consider this as you create your policies. So that's what social advocacy is all about. Okay? So what that necessarily takes us into is what about 99% of the people in the country misunderstand about the separation of church and state. So right away, if I say that we as a church are going to advocate for certain people with our government officials, our senators, our representatives, our mayors, our city councils, our governor, things like that, right away, alarm bells go off for all kinds of people. And they say, nope, you can't do that. There's the separation of church and state. And I will tell you tonight that 99% of the time, people are wrong about that because they don't understand what the separation of church and state is. So I'm just going to give you this little historical sketch right now, okay? In some of our founding documents, there's a clause that talks about a wall between church and state. It was a Thomas Jefferson clause, okay? And what he meant by that was really, in a way, quite simple, and we've made it much more complicated, and we've gotten it confused. What he meant by that, and what the founding fathers and mothers of the country meant by that, was the government cannot impose a particular religion on everybody in the country. So there can't be a state religion. So like if you live in America, you can't be told that you have to be Lutheran, or you have to be Catholic, or you have to be, and furthermore, the government can't tell you that you're not free to be an atheist too. So if you want to be, in America, an atheist, you have absolutely the right to be that. You can just completely say, I don't believe there's a God, I don't believe in God, and I'm just going to go my merry way. And nobody can do anything about that, and they shouldn't. You know, our country is founded on this kind of freedom. So, but it also means that the government can't say you have to be a Lutheran and you can't be a Catholic or something like that. The government has to stay out of that. Okay? So really the separation of church and state actually is a protection for churches and for people. And the protection is that the government can't come in and tell us what to do. It has nothing to do, absolutely nothing to do with us talking about governmental things or political things in our churches. The only thing that we can't do, well, I guess we actually probably could, but we wouldn't as Lutherans. We can't tell you, for instance, who to vote for. I would never tell you to vote for one person over another. But as a church, we might look at things that the Bible tells us to do and say, wow, we have to talk more about this out there in our society with our leaders, because it doesn't look like our country is going the right way on that. So let's just say that our country just gave up on orphans and widows and didn't ever look out for them, didn't provide any programs for them, didn't provide any help for them, okay? We would step in as a church, as an ELCA, as an Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and we would walk into some of our leaders' offices and say, we believe we're going the wrong direction here. And we want you to hear us out, because from our faith vantage point, we have something to say about orphans and widows, and we hope that you're going to start enacting some programs for people who maybe don't have very much advantage in life, and they're struggling and they're hurting and all that kind of thing. So we have every right, and we should as a church step into that conversation. Okay, so let's just stop there, and then I'm going to come back with part 2 here in just a second. All right, so now I'm going to put my safety goggles on, and here's what I'm going to say. One of the things we believe as Christians is that Jesus is God. And Jesus had a way of looking at the world that we believe is the best way. So that's why we call ourselves disciples. We follow Jesus, and we listen to his words, we let them sink into our hearts, and then we follow in the way that he wants us to go. Okay? So for instance, Jesus was a peacemaker. And so oftentimes we would always, as Lutherans and as Christians, advocate for activities that create peace, because that's who Jesus was, and that's who we believe he wants us to be too. So we would always try to advocate for peaceful solutions to things, not violent solutions. And even war, even going to war, there are lots of different philosophies on that among Christians, but war for every single Christian is always a last resort, not something we would do first. That kind of violence and killing that rips apart countries and destroys people for decades and decades, that's the kind of thing we would really advocate against. We would advocate against war. And that's something that should settle in your hearts too, as you listen to sermons and figure out who Jesus is. So I'm going to show you this. Check this out. See this big, thick file right here? This is one of 4 that I have on my desk that is full of what are called social statements. The ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, our church, has created forever, as long as it's been Lutheran all the way down, has created social statements that have been created through conversations among people in the ELCA, our leaders, our pastors, our bishops, church members, and they come out in the form of a social statement that, in this case, this one's called a social statement on our calling and education. I'm going to read this part of this one to you. This one happens to be 70 pages long. It's a really in-depth statement that we would want to present to our national leaders and our state leaders and our local leaders so that they know how ELCA Lutherans feel about education. Okay? Because we believe that God has something to say about that. The Bible is very clear about certain things related to education. I just pulled out a few more. Here's another social statement on race, ethnicity, and culture. We've got a lot of important social statements on race and racism and things like that, and how the culture is inclusive of all races. Here's another one, a pastoral letter, it's called, same thing, a social statement on wealth and poverty. There are all kinds of things that we would hope the government would do based on how the Bible talks about wealth and poverty, and how we don't want that gap between the wealthiest and the poorest to keep widening, because that's not what Jesus would have wanted for our country. Here's another one on a social statement on the church and criminal justice. It's called Hearing the Cries. And you know that Jesus always wanted people to advocate for those in prison too, because at some point, a prison sentence has to come to an end unless it's a real capital punishment thing like murder, and we talked about that a few weeks ago. And people have to be free and be rehabilitated and learn how to live in the world again in safe ways, non-violent ways. So you probably didn't know this, but I have 4 huge files in my file cabinet on social statements that the ELCA sends to our government officials, because we want to try to influence government officials in good, faith-filled, faithful ways. So I just pulled this one out, our calling in education, and I just want you to see this. At the very beginning, the writers of this said, what does God have to do with education? And then there's a whole section making the case in this social statement about God talking about specific things that relate to education. So then I go 25 more pages into it here, and here's actually a paragraph called Expectation for Public Schools. And it says, we of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America expect schools to be communities of learning and teaching. And that keyword communities is there. Schools, all schools, it says, should strive above all to be communities in which people with distinct roles join together in mutual respect around the common concern for learning, teaching, and knowing. And then it goes on to talk about that. I wanted to pull that one up because you're students and you go to school, and you didn't realize maybe that our church, the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is what St. John's is part of, along with churches of every other denomination, have groups of people called advocacy groups that talk with our legislators and then also our national Congress people, senators and representatives. And they're continually having conversations about what the Bible says and what Christians believe, certain things about our life together in our society and culture should be like. And I think you should be not only aware of that, but know that that has nothing to do with the separation of church and state. See, we can always talk to our leaders for the betterment of life. They just can't impose one particular religion on us. And I want you to realize that, because that's really been misunderstood, and it gets people just all upset, and they shouldn't be upset about this sort of thing. We have to talk about what Jesus had to say about life in this world. And that's what the church and social advocacy is all about. We always let it come from the Bible, from God's word, from God's truth. And then we see how that translates into things that happen in our life now. And then we talk to our leaders about that. So I'm going to give you the little study guide. I want you to talk about a few things. And thank you, everybody. And then I'm going to look forward to everything that's coming up now in Lent and beyond, all the way to the end of the confirmation year at the end of April. All right, everybody. Take care. Later on.